I keep a diary. I know how that sounds. A man in my profession keeping a diary is either the most arrogant thing you have ever heard or the most honest. I have thought about it for a long time, and I have decided it is both. I write because I am precise by nature, and precision requires record. I write because the people who hire me never remember the details the way I do. They remember the outcome, the relief, the money clearing, the phone call they never have to make again. I remember everything else. The 47 seconds I spent in a parking structure in downtown Hartford watching a man check his phone 3 times before he got into his car. The way the light changed on a Tuesday afternoon in March. The specific weight of a decision made by someone who will never have to live with it the way the person on the other side of it does. I write it down because someone should, and because I have been doing this long enough to know that the only honest account of anything is the one written by the person who is actually in the room. My name is not something I will give you. Names are for people who need to be found. What I will give you is this. I am 41 years old. I have been doing this work for 14 years. I have never missed a contracted target. I have never been arrested, questioned, or detained in connection with any job I have taken. I have, in 14 years, declined work on 11 occasions, not for moral reasons. Because I am not a moral man in the way the word is typically used, but for operational reasons. Jobs that were messy. Clients who were panicked. Situations where the variables exceeded my tolerance for acceptable risk. I am not reckless. I am not sentimental. And I do not, as a rule, make mistakes. This is my diary. These are my contracts. And somewhere between the first page and the last, someone has decided that I am the next name on a list. I do not yet know whose list. I do not yet know why. But I have been in this business long enough to recognize the signs, the small wrongnesses, the near misses that feel too precise to be accidental, the sense of being watched by someone who understands exactly how not to be seen. Whoever they are good, which means they have done this before, which means we have more in common than either of us would like. But we will get to that. First, let me tell you about a man named Elliot Marsh. Elliot Marsh was 53 years old, the chief operating officer of a mid-sized pharmaceutical logistics company called Veridone Group, headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina. He had been with the company for 19 years. He had built its operations division from 11 people to 230. He had, by every visible measure, made himself indispensable. He had also, by every visible measure, made himself an obstacle. And obstacles, in corporate environments, have a way of attracting the attention of people who have decided that the most efficient solution is one that cannot be appealed. The call came to me through the channel it always comes through, a broker I have used for 9 years, a man I have met in person exactly twice, whose voice I would recognize anywhere, and whose face I could not describe with confidence. He goes by the name Sable. I do not know if Sable is one person or a rotating cast of people using the same identity. In this business, that kind of ambiguity is a feature, not a flaw. Sable gave me the basics in a 7-minute call. Target, Elliot Marsh. Client, undisclosed as always at this stage. Location, Charlotte, with regular travel to Atlanta and Washington. Proposed fee, $220,000, which was above my standard rate, which told me something. Clients who overpay are either desperate or they are buying silence on top of the job. I have learned to treat both with equal caution. I asked Sable the questions I always ask. Was the target under any existing law enforcement surveillance? Sable said no, and Sable had been wrong about this exactly once in 9 years, which I consider an acceptable record. Was there a preferred window? Within 30 days. Was there a preferred method? No preference. Client wanted it to look like an accident or a natural event. That last instruction is always the most interesting one. It tells you that the client lives in the target's world, that the client will be present for the aftermath, that the client has calculated how grief should look and wants the presentation of the death to support that calculation. People who want accidents are people who have something to lose if the death looks like what it is. I spent the first 11 days on Elliot Marsh without making any contact, any approach, or any decision about method. I spent 11 days learning how he moved through the world. He drove himself to work, a 12-minute commute from a house in the Foxcroft neighborhood that he had shared with his wife Sandra for 21 years. He ate lunch at his desk 4 days out of 5. On Fridays, he walked 4 blocks to a Thai restaurant on South Tryon Street, where he had a standing reservation and where the staff knew his order. He ran 3 miles on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, the same route, a loop through Freedom Park, starting at 6:47 and finishing with remarkable consistency at 7:22. He had a heart condition, a mild arrhythmia, managed with medication, disclosed in a company medical filing from 3 years ago that had found its way to me through a source I maintain in the insurance sector. He drank moderately. He slept, judging by his light patterns, approximately 6 hours a night. He was a man of deep habit in the way that people become when they are trying to control the parts of their life that feel manageable because other parts do not. That other part was the reason someone wanted Elliot Marsh dead. Ask yourself this. What does a man have to know inside a company to make himself worth $220,000 is a problem? Not what does he have to do. What does he have to know? Because the client in this case was not eliminating a competitor. They were eliminating a witness. Elliot Marsh had spent 19 years building the operations division of Veridon Group, which meant Elliot Marsh had spent 19 years watching how things moved. Product, money, documentation, decisions. He had watched long enough to see the patterns that did not belong. He had watched long enough to understand that a portion of Veridon Group's logistics infrastructure was being used to move something that was not pharmaceutical product, and that the paperwork supporting those movements had been authored at its highest level by someone with executive signing authority. He had not gone to regulators. He had not gone to law enforcement. He had, according to what I was able to establish through the research I do on every contract, gone to the one person he believed he could trust, a board member named Patricia Wells, who had been his mentor for a decade and who had, without Elliot Marsh's knowledge, been the person authorizing the fraudulent documentation for 3 years. Patricia Wells had listened to Elliot Marsh describe what he had found. She had thanked him for bringing it to her directly. She had told him she would look into it. And then, within 72 hours, she had placed a call that eventually found its way to Sable, and Sable had called me. And I had driven to Charlotte and spent 11 days watching a man run the same 3 miles every Tuesday and Thursday morning without knowing that someone he trusted had already decided he would not run them much longer. I chose the morning run. Not because it was easy, any method can be made easy if you are patient enough, but because it was clean. Elliot Marsh had a documented heart condition. Elliot Marsh was a 53-year-old man who pushed himself physically in the way that men his age push themselves when they are trying to feel less like what they are becoming. A cardiac event during a morning run in a park, on a route he had run hundreds of times, was not a story that invited questions. It was a story that invited sympathy. I had access, through a contact I maintain in the pharmaceutical supply chain, the irony of which is not lost on me, to a compound that, introduced in the right concentration through the right vector, produces cardiac arrest in a subject with a pre-existing arrhythmia within 4 to 7 minutes of exposure. The exposure vector I chose was his water bottle. He left it in his car overnight. He filled it from a filter jug in his kitchen each morning. On the Wednesday of the 3rd week, between 2:47 and 3:15 in the morning, I introduced the compound. He ran his Tuesday route on Thursday morning because he had been traveling and had missed Tuesday. I know this because I had been watching. At 7-Eleven, on a section of path near the southern edge of Freedom Park, where the tree line reduces visibility from the main trail, Elliot Marsh stopped running. He sat down on the grass beside the path. A woman with a dog found him at 7:26. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest secondary to an underlying arrhythmia. The medical examiner noted that the level of physical exertion involved in the run was inconsistent with the level of cardiac strain the subject's condition typically produced, but attributed this to a progressive deterioration that the subject's most recent cardiac assessment, conducted 8 months earlier, had not detected. No toxicology screen was ordered at the standard level. A secondary screen, which would have required a specific request from the investigating officer, and which the investigating officer did not make, would have been necessary to identify the compound. The investigating officer did not make the request because there was nothing about the scene that told him he should. That is not luck. That is preparation. Patricia Wells delivered a eulogy at Elliot Marsh's memorial service that his wife Sandra reportedly found moving. Sandra Marsh received a life insurance payout of $400,000, which she was not expecting, and which she told Elliot's sister was the only thing that had allowed her to breathe since the funeral. The executive above Marsh at Veridung Group, a man named David Farrow, who had been Marsh's direct superior and who had been quietly passed over for the COO position 3 years earlier, was appointed acting COO within 45 days of Marsh's death. I noted all of this, the way I note everything, not because it changes what I did, but because it completes the record. Every contract leaves a shape in the world. I believe in knowing what shape I have made. The fee cleared in 3 tranches, the last of which arrived on a Tuesday. I was in a different city by then, in a hotel room with a window that faced east, writing this down. I have learned not to stay where I work. I have learned not to form attachments to the cities where my contracts resolve. And I have learned, most importantly, to notice when something feels wrong before I can articulate why. On the morning after the last tranche cleared, I found a mark on the door of my hotel room. A small adhesive dot, the kind used to label files, positioned at a height and angle that told me someone had placed it deliberately, not to mark the room, but to check whether the door had been opened. Someone had been outside my door while I was inside. Someone who knew which room was mine. Someone who had not knocked. I removed the dot. I checked out 4 hours early. I drove to a second city before I stopped. And I wrote the following in this diary, which I will not explain and do not need to. They have already started. Trust the logic. Check every detail. And understand that in my profession, the most dangerous moment is not the job. It is the silence after.